Awesome. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our historical fencing and historical martial arts A&S Roundtable. My name is Remy Delamontagne de Gascogne. Will be the moderator tonight. I'm very excited to talk about research in historical fencing and historical martial arts and kind of sword nerding with some of my closest sword nerd friends here, because we all have different levels of expertise, different awards and experience levels. So the goal really is to get people kind of talk about what we do, our different approaches, and maybe kind of answer some questions to kind of demystify what historical martial arts A&S is, so people who are interested in this and haven't started can maybe jump in and kind of get going. So first we'll do off is really quick introductions. I will start off with first we have is His Highness Donovan Shinnock, who is Premier Order of the Master of Defense, also has his laurel in historical martial arts. And I will let him talk about a little bit like some of the projects he's done and what his expertise area.
Yeah, unmute. Hi. So yeah, I've been doing this for God, I forget how long now. A long time. Um, Mostly I've focused on Italian rapier. Started with the Holy Trinity of Capoferro and Gigante and Fabris. Um, Dove real hard into Fabris. And because ADHD is a thing, have played around a tiny bit with Destreza, a little bit of Bolognese, some German sickles, um, grappling whenever people are around that want to do it, and kind of whatever seems fun at the time. Um, and I've gotten a kick out of trying to draw comparison points between these things because bodies be bodies, and they usually work the same way and they break the same way. Uh, yeah, so I've mostly been approaching this by kind of blending research and practical application, find manuals, see what they say, uh, see how they work. Can you actually look like the plates? And then just kind of going, going where the rabbit hole takes me, um,
Awesome.
and trying to make it practically applicable.
Cool. Thank you. So we also have Her Highness Chatricam Meghanta. I hope I got close to that one. I tried going fast because it's probably gonna be
Chatricam
easier.
Meghanta.
There we go.
Chatricam
Cool.
Meghanta. Yep.
Yes, yes, yes. The problem was I asked you 15 minutes ago and
Yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah.
slipped. But Mega or Meggy, as a lot of people may know her, also is a member of the Order of Defense and the Laurel, but has a very specific niche in terms of the rest of us on the panel in terms of what she studies in research. So I'll let her kind of get into that just a little bit.
Okay. So I started the SCA with a European persona and tried to follow Donovan down the Fabris hole. And what happened was that my ankle was, I have an old injury in my ankle, and that particular stance would do nothing but aggravate that ankle. So I got really depressed about fencing for a really long time because I didn't feel like I was getting anywhere because my body wouldn't do it because bodies break, as Donovan said. And then I won Bardic champs for Indian poetry, the Sangam era poetry. And I was like, oh, if I'm going to be King's Bard, I got to do it in persona, right? So I started and I'm going to fence, so I want to fence in persona. So what would that look like? Um, and this and the publication of Dr. Khorashani's book about Persian rapier gave me the in. And I started doing research down that rabbit hole. His work is a reconstruction. The Persians didn't do plates, so they don't have a history of writing stuff down in that way. It was more of a direct transmission. So what we have is a reconstructed style. And I'm not fighting Persian anyway. I'm trying to, what would the Mughals do? Basically, what would the Mughals do? And the Mughals stole everything from Persia, so I made a logical assumption that that's what they would do. And then once I got a curved sword in my hand, all hell broke loose. And basically, I discovered my true calling was to use a curved blade and all different kinds of things. I've talked a lot with Dr. Bill, who's on this call, who studies Hungarian and other saber techniques. And so now I do a lot of C&T and try to do a lot of the by the book tournaments.
Hmm.
And that's my nerd.
Awesome, thank you. We also have Bela de Sicilia, Armiger. They have a manche, I believe, also in historical martial art research area. But I'll let Bela kind of talk about what they specifically nerd out about when it comes to swords.
So hello, folks. Um, Unlike, well, perhaps not unlike, because Donovan said this a little bit, but I just really enjoy learning about anything and everything. So I've studied a number of different traditions at this point. Started on Fabris. I still do really enjoy studying that, but I have also spent some quality time with Fect 1, some quality time with Marazzo and the Bolognese system. I've also with Remy started working on classical fencing as well, which is post-period, but very interesting to look at, and learned more about saber as part of that work. I just really like looking at all the different ways that people can approach fighting and the different contexts that they think about and talk about fighting. And as a result, I love poking my head into various places and have poked my head a lot of places at this point. So that's basically my deal.
Awesome. And last but not least is Scholar Katerina Falconer de Lanark. I will let Katerina talk about their sword nerdery niche here.
Hi, all. I'm Katerina. When I started fencing, I started with trying to learn Capoferro, as is traditional at our practice. Um, that ended up not playing well with an old knee injury, and weirdly, or maybe not weirdly, Fabris worked a lot better for me in that sense. High fives, Mega. Um, so that's been my sort of primary fencing style for a long time. Over the pandemic, I ended up taking some classes in and getting very into Marazzo and Bolognese, specifically sword in two hands. And I do use that in fencing. It works a little bit better when doing C&T, just a little bit. Um, but I've really enjoyed working on that and studying that. And most recently, I have been involved in kind of a long-term, very long-term project to try to translate and maybe study and work from the Ghisliero fencing manual, rules of many knightly exercises.
Fantastic. So yeah, we got a wide variety here of of subgenres, as it were, of historical fencing and martial arts, which would be kind of cool. So to start, I want to just kind of ask you, what does martial A&S mean to you? Like, how do you approach it, both as a researcher as well as a combatant? Because everyone here does fence and does research. So how does that both of those kind of play with each other? Open the floor, whoever wants to go first, or I can pick somebody. Meggie.
Pick me, pick me. Um, I had a really good thought to this. Now it's gone. So I think with the Persian stuff in particular, when I'm doing the research, you have to take a system that is designed to kill people and back it off so that you're not hurting your friends. So there are some moves in the Persian system that are about like powering from the shoulder and cutting somebody's like head in half, like down. It's very, very popular. They love this. Is the favorite thing that they love to do was to take the sword powered from the shoulder down on top of someone's head. A good blow would take the head down to the neck in half, and a really awesome blow, you're a hero, you've got hero points, takes the blow and cuts you all the way down to the waist. We try not to do that to our friends. So it's really about taking the period techniques, for me, taking the period techniques, figure out what would be correct, and then how do I tuck it back into our rule system, right? Because some things don't apply. And so you need to buy the book to a certain point, but you also can't hurt your friends and you have to fight within this system. So it's how do you make that's why I spend a lot of time thinking about how I make the rules work in our system, because we have a system. It's not just fencing. We have a system. We have rules that are the constraints around which we can play.
If I can add on to what Her Highness has said, yeah. Besides, fighting like how they fought, within the constraints of either rapier or CNT, or using the martial ANS framework, without actually hurting our friends. A lot of what kind of drives me in here is trying to figure out how, just not just like how did they fight, but how did they do this? Um, and in a lot of ways, that sort of inevitably brings me to why did they do this? Right? There's a thing that went around a while ago about someone saying like none of this footwork makes sense. I don't understand this, and then they put on period footwear, and suddenly everything sort of clicked, right? Or similarly doing more research and trying to figure out like, so they don't really cover retreating too much in this manual. Why is that? Well, it turns out, you know, uh, dueling is a social activity and it has social consequences. And if you're backing up in front of someone, you look like a coward. So maybe don't do that. Um, or if you're doing a prize fight for the London Masters and you're on a 5-foot stage, maybe backing up's really just a really bad idea, because who needs to fall off a 5-foot stage in your life, right? But like digging around for like, okay, why did they do this? Was it just functional? Was it social? Was it a weird legal thing that meant this other more optimal option just wasn't legally available to them? um all sorts of stuff like that. And yeah, and that's usually when I get overwhelmed by options and eventually have to pick something to pay attention to, when nothing ever gets done.
Just to build slightly on what both Her Highness and His Highness were saying, I agree with what their points, but also I think on a related note, ANS can be another way to understand the material that you're already looking at, and allow you to poke at a space that you wouldn't, well, allow you to poke at a space that you wouldn't be able to poke at under our rules, but also think about the ways in which, we can adapt and get creative with what exists to make it fit within our rule set. Obviously, we're not, like, one of the things I'm working on right now is a treatise on dueling. We're not doing dueling to the death, and hopefully nobody is storing anybody else in anyone's basement. But reading about that allows me to think about and look at what we are doing in a different way. So it gives me another lens, which I really appreciate, and just another way of thinking about and looking at things.
Yeah, I'm going to continue on the same thread as what all of the other panelists have said so far, in that, it's interesting to see what the combat of the time period would have been like, for sure, absolutely. But I think that, studying the manuals can give us a lot of the historical and social context around what would have been happening before the fight and after the fight, and the context in which takes place. And I think that that's a really important thing for us to be looking at. And I think there's a lot of information that can be found there. And flipping that around, looking at the social context will make the movements described in the manual make a lot more sense. I think my primary example of this is looking at Marazzo and Bolognese Sword in Two Hands versus, some of the earlier German longsword manuals. And it's got a very different vibe to it, which starts to make a lot more sense when you realize that a lot of what Marazzo is describing, especially the gioca larga, or play at a wider range, wasn't intended to necessarily kill your opponent, or, as Mega was saying, cut their head down the middle. It was intended as a show of skill in a tournament or exhibition fight. And I actually really love that because I feel like it maps really well onto what we're doing in SCA fencing. We're not trying to kill someone, we're trying to look really cool in front of our friends. And that's period.
That's the true goal of anyone fencing, historical fencing, is to look cool, for sure. All right, so but I think what I'd like you to touch on, and this is one of the next questions I had, is that like a lot of times when we think about um, historical martial arts as an A&S project, we really think about getting a book, reading the text, looking at the picture, and then trying to interpret the plays. But I think you all touched on how it can be so much more than that, right? There's more than just like how do you defend yourself and kill the person who you're dueling with in these books. But there's so much more that we can kind of learn from. And I'd love if you all could just touch upon maybe one or two things that's kind of related to the fighting, but not quite about like how to actually dispatch your opponent. And I want to actually kick this to Baylor first because they've been because of the research has been doing into Marazzo's book 5 on dueling code law, which I think is really fascinating.
Okay. My apologies. I just need to orient myself. I was unfortunately a bit distracted when you asked that question, but I'm assuming I beg your pardon, Remy. I'm so sorry. I'm still recovering from being
Yeah,
sick.
no,
Not
it's
able
fine. I'll repeat the question for
to
you.
remind me what you just asked.
Yeah. So we all kind of touched upon how like historical martial arts and what we're studying and when we're reading the books is more than just plate interpretation, right? Like this the social context of what's going on, like Kate talked about, and you've been doing stuff on like the dueling codes or the dueling laws with Marazzo. So I'm asking everyone to like talk about like one cool thing that's related to the fighting that's not actually fighting that you've kind of stumbled upon in your work.
Oh, yes, my apologies. And you're right that a lot of the work I'm doing around dueling law is very much in that category. So in general, we talked already a little bit about the different contexts in which people might use fighting. Dueling, particularly the sort of honor dueling tradition as it moved into, it did eventually evolve into a sport, but it definitely was not a sport at the period that Marazzo was writing. And I don't know if folks on this call already know this, but he had a big work that was actually 5 different books, and different books talked about different types of weaponry, different types of fighting, and his 5th book had many chapters that were talking about the historical and legal context of dueling, and then after that he had several preza with daggers in an alley. So interesting thing to put together, and we could have a whole conversation about like why is that how he chose to organize that. But in Marazzo's case, even though he was running a school and he was writing for people who would be teaching within that context, he wanted them to understand that context, what that context would mean in a legal setting, right? If they're training people in how to use these weapons, like what liabilities do they have as people running a school? And encouraging folks to think about how this would be applied. And that in turn has implications for us, right? Like thinking about and looking at the ways in which masters were thinking about and looking at law, and which I recognize can get recursive very quickly, but I think it's very interesting, and it also gives us a better understanding of not just the fighting itself, but kind of what the masters were thinking about and looking at, which in turn provides a lot of additional context in ways that I think are really interesting. So that's my take.
Awesome. Anyone else wanted to jump on that? All right, Mega, go
Okay.
for it.
So, European focus, or the focus of historical European martial arts, has been about the individual duelist working in that space, manuals, instructing an individual at a school to do these things. The most interesting thing that I got involved in is my elephant paper. And it was, oh no, Miss Hines is laughing at me now. Um, is is I had done this research into Sangam era poetry, and there was a lot of talk around how elephants are used in the Icon, no, in the And there's so many references to elephants And I began to realize that one of the things that went with elephants is the way that they used elephants in combat and how the elephants worked in that space. And then that extended out to like how in the Sangam era the castle, not castles, but the forts were put together as a way to create barriers to allow elephants to come in. So like the gates were set up in such a way so that the elephant couldn't it was a mud wall and then you had to come around the corner and then another mud wall. So you couldn't really barrel it down with an elephant. So that was really interesting to me, is really talking about war using tools that we don't use in the SCA, but to really combat as war is something that is studied. But also, to me, my little tweak in this paper was that think that the drums were used as a way to drive the elephants crazy in combat to make them more fierce, and that the ways that they would drug the elephants, excuse me, feed them prime food in order to get them to be so fierce in combat that people would run away. So there should be more elephants. I'm all about elephants, especially as it relates to martial arts. Okay. Sword and elephant. Yes, please.
Nice. Katerina, Donovan, do you have anything cool that you've stumbled across that kind of relates to sword related, but not actually how to hit someone with a sword?
So a little while ago, I was poking at the London Masters of Defense because, like, if you're doing, what we think of as late period stuff in that area, not to, you know, not to steal the point from Mega, but they are sort of the elephant in the room, right? They're the I don't want to say guild, but they're certainly the mob, I guess, that handled that. And one of the things that they did, Herbert Berry has a fantastic, though sadly I believe out of print, book where he just recopied out a bunch of papers and records from the London Masters that he found. And we know that when they wanted to rank up in their, guild, they did public prize fights, right? And we know that, okay, so if you want to rank up, the student had to pay a fairly reasonable chunk of money to do it, right? They needed to make sure that it was advertised sufficiently. They needed, if anyone was traveling further than 20 miles from London, the student needed to pay their travel fees, right? Like it was it was a whole thing. It sort of started to approach pyramid scheme. Um, but but then, you start realizing like the ridiculous moneymaker this was and why they had these things in inn yards that set up the same stages that acting troops would use. And charge a fee to people who entered, and if the crowd really liked um, your display fights that were voted on by the ancient masters, right? It was they were fought for acclaim and they were fought to show skill, not so much the way we typically fight in tournaments, but you were graded effectively. And if the crowd liked it, they'd throw money at you. So it could be a real moneymaker for the student when all is said and done. But this drove me down the rabbit hole of finding out how big these stages typically were so I could set up that size list for a by the book tournament. Um, and Mr. Berry did a number of inn and tavern related um, dives. And I think it was in his book about the Boar's Head Inn. I managed to hunt down what the most likely size for the stage in the inn yard was, right? Like, and that's tied back into let's do a tournament with this size list, and if you step out, you lose. Because you fell and broke something. And even if you didn't, you looked real bad to the crowd. So yeah, like there's always something not specifically martial that you can like if you like see it, you can always find something to just dive into.
Yeah, we've used your research and like the estimation of the sizes for like a number of tournaments. Right? I've done that with by the book a few times. I use it for another like duelist tourney and stuff because it's kind of cool. It's a way of getting a historical-esque size to the list instead of just picking something kind of random, which is kind of cool. That's a cool way in which like Donovan's research has affected fencing in a tournament, which is kind of cool because these we kind of live with one foot in both worlds here, both the A&S research side and the practical tournament sports side. So it's kind of cool to see those crossovers like that. Kate, anything you wanted to add for this question?
Yeah, actually, one of the rabbit holes I ended up sticking my nose into working with the Gizliero text is learning more about the actual physical copies of the extant texts themselves that we have. So Gizliero wasn't as popular as, let's say, Marazzo, who had two printings of his book, or two editions at least. Um, One of the things that's really cool about the text is the way that the plates are drawn, in that they are hand drawn in each individual copy of the manual. So there are slight differences between different copies of the book, which is wild. Um, but it's really cool looking at the way that uh, it kind of gets into the art style of the time period. So drawing in perspective was starting to be a real big thing around then. So in the plates, they specifically try to incorporate this both, in the footwork in the foreground. And then you'll see in the background, there's like a little picture of a house or a town and some birds, like just so the viewer knows, hey, we're doing that cool perspective thing that everyone's hype about. Um, but uh but yeah, it's after looking at, other manuals where uh all of the illustrations are printed plates, the fact that Gizliero had like a handful of copies of this book printed up and then paid someone to individually hand draw all of his illustrations, and he's got a bunch, is really wild and really cool to me.
Yeah, it's really cool. And I really enjoy his art because he shows the perspective and he shows frontal views of the guards, not just profile like we see in like a lot of the other late 16th and early 17th
Yeah,
fencing
it's
masters,
the
which is cool.
first time that I've seen a print of, someone standing in a fencing guard and it's head on rather than from the side view.
Yeah.
Um, I can stop yelling about that now.
So basically, the goal of that question is for people who are watching this live or at the recording is like historical martial arts and A&S doesn't have to be just about how to sword good, right? It doesn't have to be like, well, here are the specific techniques. There's a whole world of stuff that you can kind of learn from this in terms of the social context of the duel, or like the artwork, or like how did you become a fencing master, right? Or elephants, right? Like there's a whole, it's more than just sorting and how to d defend yourself and kill your opponent, which I think is really cool. So people looking to get into martial A&S, there's a those are some cool doors to maybe kind of open and rabbit holes to kind of run down. And for the next question, kind of related to this, is I want to ask folks, where do you get your ideas from? Like when you set a project, where does it come from? Does it happen randomly? Did you like sit down like I'm going to research X, Y, and Z now? Like what's everyone's process for this?
I get out of the shower and I have a new idea. Like I think somewhere I've got a notebook just full of random research ideas or random things that just like occur to me. Like or like I'm fencing, like I don't know, since I see him on my screen, like I'm fencing Firebow and we have an exchange and I'm like, that's a different solution than Fabris came up with for that situation. Huh, weird. And then I start reading and like, man, ideas just show up. Like anywhere. Hey, what if? Or that's weird. That's weird is always a good starting place.
I agree with that. I think that I'll run into something and I'll be like, that's not that ain't no. So I'll do my research and I'll be like, mother of wow, that is true. That's weird. Why? And then it's like becomes a little bit of an obsession, like the elephant paper was like that. because I saw a video of a guy who was playing a drum for an elephant, and there's a little thing on the side that said, elephants can sense rhythmics through the soles of their feet and their trunk. And every song and poem I had read for the last 3 years crashed into my brain, and then oh my God, but what about this person? What about that person? How did that go? And like, do you understand it? And so then I started researching elephant biology, which has nothing to do with war, right? Or swords, but it does because they were using elephants as a vehicle of war, and so it was all related. It's war. The Greeks studied war. The Romans studied war. They studied war as a whole thing. This is how the Indians did it. This is how the Mughals did it. This is how Sangam era folks did it, and it becomes obsessive. I think Donovan sort of has that right. Go on a tangent. Basically, if you find something cool, go on a tangent. I recommend tangents for all. Tangents for all.
A royal decree. All right, Bella, Katerina, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree with their highnesses in that it'll just be a random thing that sticks in my brain, or I'll be, scrolling on my phone at 2 in the morning and see, oh, huh, this fencing manual text that has no translation has just been uploaded as a PDF to the French National Library. Well, let me take a quick look at that real quick. Huh. I bet I could do something with this. Um, or another one that kind of stuck in my head for a little while was I was looking at the cloak section of the Gizli Arrow book and went, I wonder how this compares to what Marazzo says about cloak, because there's 40, 50 years in between those. So I was just suddenly really curious about how the approach might have changed in that time period. It's like, all right, let me start translating this section, I guess, so I can see what it says, so I can see how it compares to Marazzo, and just reading through it and trying to figure it out.
Yeah, hey, speaking of cloak, like, how did you get your idea, Remy?
I got my idea from my paper because Kate bought me a sharp rapier for my birthday a few years ago. I'm like, I got to do some cool science experiments with this. So give someone a sharp sword and they'll find maybe some fun uses for it. But so people who don't know what Donovan is alluding to, my paper that I entered in A&S Champs this year was on researching sword and cloak use from the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe specifically. And also, so I took that, compared it to the SCA rules. Then I took a sharp sword, got a ballistics gel arm, wrapped a wool cloak around it. So I made this period wool cloak, and then did cut, slices, and thrusts with different levels of wraps to kind of see what level of protection a wool cloak will actually kind of give you. So it's kind of cool to compare that to what the masters said, and also what our rules say or do not say about stuff. So that's how I got that idea. I got a cool gift for a birthday party for my birthday.
Buy your friend sharp swords. They
Yeah,
need research papers.
yeah,
Guaranteed. Heard it here first.
absolutely. Um, so kind of related to all this, because those were great answers, is what do you think is actually, for one, before I move on to that, one of the way I got one of my first A&S paper that I did is I was reading through Alfieri, who's a mid 17th century Italian fencing master. We got two different translations, so I was comparing the two translations, and there's a couple of spots where the translations were different enough that if you were to interpret the play, it would drastically change what technique or what tactics you were kind of learning in the process of that. So people that are really into plate interpretation, I think it's kind of cool if you can get two translations and see if there's any differences, kind of compare, contrast, and maybe do some sleuthing to figure out which one is more correct. That was one of the notes I got in my paper that I didn't do, was I didn't really choose a side. So if anyone does something like that, learn from my mistake, be more of a sleuth, and kind of pick a side on that one. Um,
Before you get off of that, I just want to
sure.
say, so I'm a poet first, and I do all these other things later. But in poetry as well, that's one of the things you do is you look for multiple translations of the same poem so that you can get to sort of sort of a more holistic understanding of what the poet may have meant. So I see this as exactly the same, only, add in the physical mechanics as well.
Yeah, I definitely see it as like get a better idea of what the spirit of what the master's
Right.
trying to say here. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
It's translation. It's always translation.
Yeah, and translation is a type of interpretation. Like you got to like just make choices. So that's something to keep in mind. Um, so for folks who are dipping in their toes to martial ANS for the first time or are thinking about it, what do people think is a good first project? Which I realize is maybe it's a very open-ended question, maybe a bit of a loaded question. I'm kind of curious of what people think. If some baby ANS person came up to you and was like, I want to do a paper on swords, I need a direction, where would you send them or what direction?
I think my question back for them would be what seems interesting to you? Because that's for me the primary motivation for what project I'm going to work on or what I'm going to look into is what is currently interesting. So if I know what someone's interested in and I know of sources, I can recommend those, but I can't tell them what they find interesting. That's something you kind of have to figure out for yourself.
Anyone else?
I'm gonna cheat and say, what would your persona do? Right? Like if you're doing swords and you have a persona that's Italian or Hungarian or uh, African. There's some good African resources out there now for sword fighting where there wasn't before. What would your persona have done? How would they be thinking? That's like if you're like, I want to do swords, you're like, cool, but you have this name. It's not your name, it's your persona's name. What would your persona do? And I would take it that direction. And then you may find, like I did, that the persona that you have is not interesting to you, so you switch. Yeah, call me and we'll talk.
I sort of like for someone who's brand spanking new at this, like I sort of want to start by just asking like what direction do you want to go in? Right? Like, are you a human who wants to um look at historical martial arts as someone who wants to practice, like, do you want to go do them um right now in this moment, right? Like this isn't a forever question, but like for this idea you've got or what you want to do first, like do you want to do this? Do you want to research them, compare, contrast them? Do you want to do stuff that's like touched by the combat stuff but is adjacent to it, like, you know, the footwear, um, the legal dueling codes around it and how that impacts things, like similar to what Kate said, like what interests you? Because that's really going to determine like, do you want to go grab some plates and start working through them? Do you want to start translating a book at 2 in the morning? Who would do that? Um, do you want to look at the poetry of the time and see how that compares to how they were fighting at the time? Like, what do you want to do? And because if you don't want to, like, if you don't want to pick up a sword and do this, like, cool, there are tons of options open to you, but like, I'm not going to say you should go interpret plates like personally yourself, in a gym. But there are so many other ways you can go.
I think I'd like to add that I think was sort of touched upon by several panelists, but I think about in a slightly different way, is in addition to what interests you, what are you curious about? What do you have questions about? Because frequently research involves, as the name suggests, a lot of research. And often, especially when you're first like thinking about and approaching things, what you have questions about will lead to more research organically. It will lead to more interest in that research. And if it's something that a lot of people have questions about, it's also more likely to be an interesting research paper to other people. So just sort of thinking in terms of like, what is it that I want to know? What is it that I think other people, like, what is it that I want to know and how does that relate to what other people already know? And how does that relate to the history we're all studying?
Cool. So let's say I'm a new baby A&S martial art person here. I have an idea, and I come running up to you all. Uh, but I need help. I don't know where to start. Like, what resources do people use? Where do I go to start researching this stuff? We're talking about like books, websites, organizations, any videos, anything that you know that you've used or know is a good resource. What is something you have for this person?
Let me give you the good word of Wichtenauer.
Yes, worked an hour.
Um, right. So Wichtenauer is run by a gentleman named Michael Chidester, and it's a wiki of historical manuals. Some of them are translated for free on site. Quality of the translation varies. Um, it's free. You get what you pay for. But some of them are quite good. Um, but he's also got a list of links to published traditionally published translations. Print-on-demand sites like Lulu get a whole lot of business from there. Like first go-to. Are you looking for a how-to sword idea? Start there. You will probably not be disappointed.
Anyone else want to jump in on this one too? Maybe Mega, because I know what you do is very different, and you probably wouldn't find as much on Wikta now because that's very European centric for the most part.
I threw something in the chat. There is a Dr. Khorashani's uh, video YouTube channel is about showing the Persian way of fighting, and since it's a reconstructed style, it's based off of the epics of Persia and the sort of the material culture that's left behind, as well as illuminated manuscripts. And he, having been a child growing up in Persia, dealing with the wrestling of Persia and dealing with the archery of Persia, he sort of also he speaks like four languages. He's a genius, but basically he reconstructed the style, and the YouTube channel is a good way to start to learn about that particular culture. And see what you can do to apply it. It's like it's useful because it's shamshir, it's curved swords, right? Spear and buckler. Sorry, tar, big shield. All my nouns are gone. It's very late at night, big shield, dagger and that kind of thing. But it's you can sort of follow along with the videos and it's helpful. And he has a lot of research and work in there. So I'm gonna point you back to him. So he's the one doing the work right now. His books are extremely expensive. So I like to go onto the YouTube channel and sort of like follow along with him. That's how I have learned. I did eventually buy the book. Y'all actually, if I remember correctly, bought me the book once for my birthday, and so I'm here because of you. Um, so I'm going to answer Orlando's question once we get to it, but we'll let everybody else talk.
Cool.
Um,
I'll one thing I did want to we do have on the East Kingdom wiki there is we probably haven't updated in a while, but there's a historical martial arts wiki page that has a whole bunch of links to different authors, different subjects, different like styles, and also different like historical fencing schools. So I just dropped that link into the chat. But if you search historical martial arts or fencing, there'll be different links for that, and you can it's a good place to also start.
I also dropped a link to the Historical African Martial Arts Association. I know about that mostly through Demont Stiff, who was, I think, instrumental in starting it, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
They're an absolutely fantastic resource for anything touched by anything that's touched by the historical African area. Of note to the SCA right now, Sir Seto from the Mid-Realm is on their managing council. So if this is of interest, I bet he'll be at Pennsic and would probably be ecstatic if you rolled up on him and had questions. I think it's safe to say that if he's a sword nerd, he'll love that.
Katerina and Bailey, any other cool sources that you have in mind that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I'm gonna drop a link in the chat to the Florio 1611 Italian English dictionary. It's not sword specific, but it is a dictionary from this time period, which is really useful if you're working with a text, uh, especially in a language like Italian, and I guess also English, that has shifted so much between now and then. Um, this has been a really great resource. And even if you're not doing translation, but you study Italian fencing manuals and just want to see what the words mean and meant at the time, it's actually really interesting. And because of this project, I have been the kind of person who reads the dictionary for fun. But there's a 1611 edition, which is the bigger one, and there's an earlier 1598, which is a little bit more condensed, but it's occasionally useful to look at both of them because they're not going to always have the same content.
Nice. And for people that are watching this recording, I am collecting all these links, so hopefully we can put it in the video description of this recording, so you're not trying to figure out how to spell Wiktenauer or any of these other names on the fly here. Bella, anything else you wanted to add to this?
Everybody stole my answers. I would have said Wiktenauer, I would have said Florio. And sites like Lulu can be really helpful as well, particularly if you're looking for, sometimes they have more affordable things on that site. I guess the only thing that people haven't said yet that I think is helpful as well is looking at secondary sources for materials, particularly if you're studying something like Fact One, which the source itself does not contain a lot of information. It's basically a comic strip with some Latin. So looking at how other people have interpreted that can be very valuable for formulating your own interpretation and your own understanding of the text. So I'd recommend that as well. And I have a couple of texts, excuse me, on the fact book that I would be happy to recommend to folks.
Awesome. And I think also like don't forget to like use other people's papers, right? Like build off other people's research. That's one thing I did in my cloak paper is that there is a fencer, I think he's in Onstior, who created Swordbot and basically had created a robot with a sharp sword at the end of it and would basically thrust at different types of fabric that male doublets would have been made out of to find out like how much pressure do you need to penetrate a silk doublet versus a wool doublet and having like all the linen shirts and stuff underneath it. So that was kind of useful for me when I was working on my paper and was able to quote. So working off other Scadians and other researchers in the HEMA historical fencing world is I think is also pretty cool and pretty good because it is such a niche thing that we kind of do. I want to get into a couple of tailored questions here. So I got a couple of questions that are aimed at specific people in our panelists here, and I'm gonna start with Meggie. So Megha, you're doing something that's very different. If you talked about a few times here with studying Persian martial arts and kind of adapting it to your Mughal persona and stuff. What sort of challenges have you run into trying to one figure out what they do and how to do it, and then also adapt it to SCA fencing? And anything else you think might be kind of cool to talk about related to that?
So there's so in Indian research, there's a lot of the Victorians, right? And the Victorians messed up a lot of things. I mean, they did it for European history too, but they really did it because they're colonizers in India at that time. So there's a lot of sensitivity that I need to bring to my reading. I have to need to understand who's writing, what their perspective is, what culture they came from, maybe a little bit of the biases, and I have to interpret everything. I get a lot of links sent to me from various like, hey, what about this Indian sword stuff? It's not Mughal, it's sort of over here in Tamil Nadu, or there's this stuff that's over here that's taking place in, Chennai or whatever, and you need to look at this as really cool. And I'm like, this is a modern, like it might be ancient, it might go back 100 years, it might go back 200 years. But that's still out of period for us. Where did it come from? I have no idea. things that were written down in India, often on palm leaf manuscripts, didn't necessarily survive very long because large parts of India are hot and wet and things disintegrate. And they didn't write things down anyway. Mostly what they did was translate from sort of go from sort of from the teacher directly to the student in a direct translation. So that stuff was not really written down. So that is a challenge. So I basically apply a lot of C in the SCA, a lot of creativity to my interpretations. I try not to be a middle-aged white lady as I do it. I try not to come at it from the perspective of a sort of a colonial culture looking in India, and I try to sink myself into that space. Whether I'm successful or not, I don't know. I do try to listen to folks who are writing now about people who get it, but like there's a lot of yoga stuff and like what people should do when they go to festivals and don't wear a bindi and all this. And I have changed my own interpretation both of swordplay and my own persona based upon modern voices telling me what is and is not appropriate. So that sensitivity part is what I'm doing because I don't have a manual to study from. And because so it is sometimes I feel like I get two steps forward and I take one step back. All the time, all the time, all the time. Did that
That-
answer your question?
It does, yeah, yeah. It's just kind of weird, like, because it's so different, and because we've talked about like it doesn't have most of us when we do like if I go to Italian fencing, there are hundreds, not hundreds of books, but there are tons of books I can pick up and
Right.
learn how to do it from that era, and that's just something that you don't have. So you got that extra level of challenge and stuff. So yeah, just it was kind of cool just to kind of like,
Also footwork, right? So like
yeah,
they'll do footwork, but the Mughals in particular, they were on horseback, and so like there's no like footwork. My feet were in stirrups. So like there's no footwork. So like what I want to do is get on a horse,
yeah.
right? And wave my talwar around. And so people are like, "Well, how does your footwork work?" And I'm like, "I get out of the way when someone's charging me, and then I get back in. There are no rules. There are no gods, no masters."
So
So
we need to get Maggie both a horse and an elephant. This is for people who are looking for the next reign, a horse and an elephant for Maggie. I think that was a great answer to the question. I really appreciate it. This next one is for Katerina and Bela. I got let one person back into the room. Cool. So you both have done some translation work of books. I'm just kind of curious of what your process is like for that, what challenges you've run into, what resources you've used, just like your general experience of book translating, because that's something I haven't done and sounds absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, so I dropped one of the resources in the chat, which is the Florio Dictionary. Um, I think that it is definitely a very challenging process. We get to learn about things like there can be many different definitions for a particular word in a text. So there's some work involved in figuring out which is the correct one that applies here. Bela and I have both run into a situation where a specific word does not appear in, for example, the Florio 1611. And what was really fun is the word appears in the 1598 edition, but is not defined. It's just there by itself, no further information. So the two of us had an interesting time trying to figure that one out. Bela, feel free to jump in if you also want to yell about Scherzo.
So I am gonna agree with Kate, but also building on what she just said. Being able to sound check with other people around you when you're translating is incredibly valuable. Like, hey, I'm looking at this right now. It seems to say this. Does this match your understanding of what this word might mean in context, right? Or, hey, I'm looking at this and I think it could mean this or this. Do you have any thoughts? Incredibly helpful to get someone else's perspective outside your own head As folks have already said, translation is very much its own research, its own sort of process. And it can be really invaluable. Just like it's helpful for someone to edit a paper, it's sort of the same thing. It's helpful for someone to, if you meet them to take a look and get another perspective. But also in terms of what the process looks like, Kate's right that it's a lot of like yelling about Scherzo at random times, trying to figure out like what does this word mean? What does this word mean in context, especially when you're looking at languages that have shifted so much in the time since this text was written. And so it's kind of like almost its own art, I think it's fair to say, and a very rewarding and fun one, but definitely a combination of different hats, as it were. The other thing I'll add, and different people may feel differently about this, is I discovered when I sat down to start work on the fifth book, I didn't necessarily want to do chapters in order. I initially sat down and thought like, I'm gonna start with Capitolo, 201, and we're just gonna keep going iteratively. And then I realized that that's a great way to beat your head against a wall against one chapter for several months and not make it to another chapter because you have gotten stuck. So part of the process is recognizing if you're stuck on one piece, maybe it's time to go look at another piece. Also, I disagree with my esteemed colleague in that I try not to translate things at 2 a.m. because it's really easy to make mistakes when you do that. You come back the next day and you're like, what was I even doing?
Okay, listen. I was not translating at 2 a.m. At 2 a.m., I found the text and was trying to see if I could read the original Italian.
Okay, fair enough. The process.
But yeah, I completely agree with your approach to the text in a non-linear way. I went through the first 25, 30 pages, and then I got stuck on one section in the Gisliero text because I got mad at him. He was describing different dagger guards, and the third one he just described as, and this is the best one. I'm like, cool, buddy, you're not giving us any additional information. What is wrong with you? And from that point, I ended up sort of skipping around in the text, like looking at the cloak section and just working off of whatever parts seemed interesting to me at the time. Because otherwise, like Bela said, it's just sort of beating your head against the wall. As far as the process, one of the things that I would end up doing a lot is as I'm going through the text, running into terms. So I would look things up in the Florio dictionary. And then if the translation still wasn't making sense, I would then take the English word that Florio translated to from the Italian and run that through the Oxford English Dictionary to see if the meaning of the English word has changed since that century and what it means now as opposed to what it meant at the time. So that's also kind of weirdly fun for me. And yeah, being able to discuss with other people is definitely useful. As part of the Gisliero work, I've ended up on a group chat with two other people working on similar projects. One of which is another fencer out in Locac who has recently completed a draft of a translation, which if you go on Wiktenauer, that's what you'll see for Gisliero's text there. And then a guy who did an AI translation of it, which is a fascinating approach. I think that it's of dubious quality because AI doesn't know a lot about historical fencing. And I was scanning through this text that he had sent me that was generated by an AI translation. trying to see, okay, how did it translate some specific sections that were, that would be different from how I did it. And I noticed that some parts were just straight up missing. Like it's just not there. The AI skipped right over it. Um, so I am very skeptical of that approach to translation. If your goal is to be able to read the text, and even more skeptical if your goal is to do Marshall ANS research, because I think that there's a lot of context that you, the human, are providing for the text that the computer's not going to be able to do for you.
Yeah, and like go just real quick, I know the whole AI thing we could spend like 3 hours just debating or yelling about that. But I had one fencing student who was trying to learn the system that I'm teaching him in class through ChatGPT, and like it spit out everything wrong because ChatGPT doesn't know anything about Italian fencing. It goes straight to modern sport French fencing, like that kind of stuff. So, yeah, you can get some wild stuff from that, and I would look for anything with that with extremely dubious eyes. All right, next question I want to throw to Bela because Bela, who we've just been talking about, has been translating Barassa's book 5, which is on dueling law and dueling code and all that stuff. And Bela, by trade, is a lawyer, right? So this is a cool crossroad of expertise at your day job and you went to school for with your hobby here. And I'm just kind of curious of like how those interplay when you're working on that particular project.
Yeah, those definitely end up coming up in tandem all the time on that project in a way that I think is really cool and really helpful. Obviously, what you're taught in law school in the 20th or 21st century is not going to look like what a 15th century jurist was looking at per se. But especially in academic settings, law is a field that has a lot of very old traditions, and some of the language that's used in those texts is are Latin terms we still use today, if in a variety of ways. And it's both very interesting and very edifying, being able to piece together the different, especially because Marozzo was writing in Bologna when he was writing at the very end of the Holy Roman Empire. And he pulled from multiple different types of texts while he was types of law texts and law traditions while he was writing about it. So that was an area that had a lot of different influences on it at once. So at some parts he talks about Lombardy laws, at some parts he talks about what we could think of as like Holy Roman Empire criminal code. It's helpful to be able to look at those different jurisdictions and especially when he starts like quoting what jurists said in presentments in previous times, he starts really looking at legal like elements of law in ways that I think it's very helpful to have that background for, but is still I think very interesting and in some ways very relevant even without the legal background. But I looked at that, saw no one had translated it, and went, well, no one can stop me, and I do have the law background, and just started going. And it's been a really cool process.
That's really cool. And you've done a presentation at IGX, which is one of the big local HEMA events around here on that, which was really kind of cool to see. Next tailored question I'm going to send out to Donovan. So we've been talking a lot about Marshall ANS a lot, mostly on like the research side, but we also have Marshall ANS rules that kind of let us actually do some of the more dangerous things that are in the fencing book in a very safe manner. So I wanted just to kick it to you to talk about a little bit more in depth about what that rules are and like what the general idea is, and also how you've used it in your own research.
Okay, so I just dumped a link into chat. I think all of the links are absolutely going to overflow the show notes, but that's cool. Um, so to summarize, the SCA has instituted what they call Marshall ANS rules. They're guidelines, really. the nutshell version is, hey, if you want to like recreate some of these plays and techniques that aren't safe to do in the list, under any of our standard combat rules, you can do it. Um, the limitations are you can't be doing it competitively. That's not to say you can't be running through plays, um, like the two people running through the plays can't be antagonistic, but you can't be like there's no trying to win a tournament. Like you can be trying to beat the other person, but it's a collaborative effort. You need to wear whatever armor seems to make the most sense, or whatever protective gear isn't stupid. Um, Other than that, don't hurt each other, right? Like, run through them at whatever speed is safe. Don't be dumb. Don't get us in trouble. Um, so this has let people work through. I've seen people using spear techniques from a variety of sources, or poleaxe techniques, any pole weapon technique, right? Because I don't think, barring the very limited use of butt spikes in armored combat, you can't strike with the haft or the butt of a weapon in any of our uh, combative frameworks. I've seen them work through here perfectly safely, lots of fun. Poleaxes are mean and funny if you're that type of human. Right? Like you can do before we started the grappling experiment in C&T. By we, I mean the mid-round started it, but we were using it here for a while. Like a lot of the unarmed stuff, Fury's takedowns. Um, I used it to play around with some of Mayer's sickle plays, because he's got, I think, 12 or 14 really sweet built-out plays for the farming sickle. And I think my favorite line from the last one is turn their head to face the sun. So yeah, we can't do that competitively. Uh, but like you run through them slow, don't be dumb, and it really opens up a lot of ways for us to dive into these manuals and dive into these techniques, in the setting of this game that we play, right? Like you don't need to leave sight. You don't need to do it at an unofficial practice, wink, wink. Like, no, we can do it here. Do you want to see what like Fury's spear looks like against Marazzo's, sword in two hands? Sure, great. Like let's do that. Um, but the big key is we're doing it collaboratively. It's a collaborative attempt to learn, maybe try and, you know, beat the other person for funsies, right? Like to succeed in your use of the technique, I think is a better way to put it. But it opens up, God, it opens up so much. It opens up so many things that we just can't do safely competitively.
Yeah, so it's really cool. We actually have like a bunch of different avenues for like studying this stuff, right? We got the research paper side of like I've run down this rabbit hole. Now I'm gonna yell at 50 people that I can get quoted in a room about my research. We got that, which is really cool. We can take stuff that we've learned and apply it to our actual fencing in the fencing list, right? Like a lot of us all trying to apply the things we've learned from historical fencing books into tournaments, which is really cool. Like if you watch Donovan and Meggie fight at Crown, you're going to see them apply the techniques that they've been studying and learning over years and stuff, which is really cool. And then we got the Martial A&S rule set, which kind of allows you to explore the wider, more dangerous or unsafe kind of stuff in a way that you can still get some cool stuff out of it. That's not going to get anyone injured or in trouble, which I think is really cool. So we're kind of lucky in that we can really explore this stuff in three different dimensions, which I think is really fascinating. It might be kind of cool to see someone that kind of like try to do all three into one kind of project, really like connect all those dots and use all three resources in that regard. All right, we got some. So that's my main questions. We got about 15 minutes. So I'm going to open the floor to audience questions. So I'll have people put them in the chat. I've been trying to, as they've come through the chat, copy and paste into a Google Doc here. So we'll see how many we can get through in the next 15 minutes here. First one came from Facebook a day or two ago. I'm going to read this. Quote, it says, I read a lot of historical sources to improve my personal style, but I'm curious to see how do I start showing this? Like I have a source I read recently about how to fight people with curved swords in 16th century Destreza mindset. How do I start? Can I do a presentation on what I found and demonstrate and explain it?
Yes, please do a demonstration. Please do a presentation on it. That would be dope.
Yeah, so this seems like a thing that could kind of fit almost all three, right? You can throw it in like fight Meggy. See, Meggy will take their curved sword, fight Meggy, see how it works. Do the research paper to see what they actually said, and if there's anything you would want to do to Meggy but can't do to Meggy for safety concerns, you can maybe walk it through with Meggy with the Marshall A&S. But yeah, I think just do it. Run down that rabbit hole. You can share stuff in chunks, right? It doesn't need to be this giant doctoral thesis. It can be just like a couple of cool little things that you demonstrate or show here and there, or teach as a workshop, or do a little blog post on, and maybe it turns it into something bigger. But yeah,
like that's the Venn diagram of it. Like it can be pure research. It can be let's screw around with swords together. Like it can be the intersection of all of these things. Ideally, it is the intersection of all of these things, but like, do it all.
The specific example being given in this question also seems like it would be a good thing to show in a by the book event, because we do those at a number of locations or a number of different events at this point in time, and they're designed for really exactly that type of thing. I saw something cool in a manual. Maybe I can't do it in a fight, but I want people to see it. So I'm going to demonstrate it so that I can share it with more people.
Awesome. Next question that we got in is the quote is, how do you get ideas without plagiarizing or just regurgitating, rewording their various sources? So that's the quote. I'm kind of taking this to kind of mean, how do you take an idea and make it original in your own, as much as how do you rewrite an idea or a piece of paragraph that you want to put into your paper? So I kind of see that one having two different dimensions to the question. I feel like is a bit of a tough cue.
Okay, that was a long enough awkward silence, so I'll start. I mean, so welcome to academia, right? Like that's how research do. I guess I could be snarky and just say, hey, go review a number of college standing principles about plagiarism and ethical use, right? Like, but like, quote, attribute everything. If you're worried about taking, like, contrast them and then draw and then start writing your own thoughts, your own conclusions. Like, I'm not sure what to say about this other than you can't attribute too much, right? Like no one would be upset with you if you over attribute things.
I think also building on what Donovan just said, comparing resources might also be a way, in addition to just if it looks like this person's talking about secondary sources and how do I not just repeat arguments that were made by other people when they were examining a practice or text. One thing you can do if you're already looking at secondary sources is look at several different secondary sources and think about which pieces of these do I think are correct and why, and then you can write about why you found one argument more credible than the others. And then it's not plagiarism, then it's your thoughts about what someone else had written. Although, as His Highness said, please do attribute that when you do that work. It's important to give credit.
Yeah, disagree with one and start arguing against it. Those will be all your thoughts, guaranteed.
Fantastic. Next question kind of harks back to something we talked about earlier. So the start of, I think this was specifically Meggy when describing the type of stuff that you have learned about, like hitting someone in the head and cleaving through, and how you got to adapt this to be safe in our SCA rule set. The question that came in is, quote, curious if any of the panelists have found indication how the students in this time period would practice these forms modified to make him safely, right? You're working with a fencing master or your teacher. They're showing you this very brutal move. How do you practice? Has anyone found any research or resources on uh, talking about how the fencing masters of the day taught that safely to their students so they could practice it? I have not, at least not in this period of fencing.
I'm gonna be conjecture for just a second,
Sure.
because a lot of what I do is conjecture. So, my thought about that, and when I saw that question go by on Facebook, um, and I started thinking about how Dr. Khorashani teaches with katas. So a lot of his practitioners are separated throughout the globe, and they often don't. And this goes back to another question I saw go by today, which was, what advice do you have to the solo practitioner? Um, so I'm going to combine them all together. Sorry. And that it was, he has his people do what amounts to being katas, right? So they are practicing the moves as if it is a flow to sort of do it over and over again. Um, so you're not doing it against somebody else and you're practicing it over. That's an Eastern art to take moves and put them into a kata. I can't speak to how the Europeans did it, but that to me is a way to both solo practitioner and also repeat moves over and over again so that you're not hurting somebody else. So those are the two things that come together in that way.
I'm gonna jump in and courteously disagree with Her Highness Megha, in that there are some European traditions that have a similar practice. For example, a lot of Marazzo's instruction is done via something similar to kata. He calls them assaults. And it's a sequence of movements that are chained together in a particular way. He uses them to teach a specific skill or approach. You know, if your opponent is in such and such guard, here is a sequence of movements that you can use. So one of the things that, I end up doing is running through the parts of the assault in this type of flow. And I feel like that is also useful for, solo practitioners, excuse me. It's useful for practicing things that he talks about that I'm not going to necessarily use in a fight against another person. And it allows me to learn the body mechanics of those movements. And from there, I can start to think about how I might want to modify them to apply to a fencing or C&T environment.
And for
Also an interesting example because he was writing the Opera Nova as an instructor for instructors. So he has some notes, particularly in the first couple of books, where he says, like, here's what you should do with students first. And if they can do these things safely, maybe they can do these other things safely. So he was actually talking about, it's not the same as modifying weapon, obviously, but it's another form of thinking about safety and learning that's directly woven into the text, which creates a really interesting perspective for the text itself.
For other primary sources, I've been a big fan of the Vienna Anonymous lately. That's been my recent rabbit hole because it's essentially class notes from a student. And it's neat, but so far I haven't tripped over anything in there that describes like, oh, well, we're practicing it like this, even though we wouldn't use it like this. But primary sources can also be physical. And a few people in chat mentioned fetters and descriptions of baited blades. I've seen, I don't remember in which museum, like a period fencing mask. Like it looks kind of big and clunky. It's like the fencing mask version of one of those diving bell helmets, kind of. But but it's clearly something that they were definitely thinking about. Hey, how can I actually go full contact? I've seen baited blades from period, and I think there were a couple doublets that the museum cited them as padded training doublets. Now, I mean, museums call things all sorts of things, but it wasn't padded in like just a piece cod sort of way. It was, quilted and padded and not like a gambeson, like one under armor. So like they were thinking about it. They used hardware and like Bella and Katerina and Mega said, like they were definitely thinking about techniques to use, but
Yeah, in
I
Orlando, sorry, and I was saying like yeah, in Orlando the Shah talked about like the foil blades and stuff, and that's one that they have in the Musée d'Armée in Paris. They got a foiled rapier blade. So it's a period rapier. It looks like a lot that we use in the SCA, but it's got this big leather ball kind of at the end. But the blade's a little bit different. It's more like a really fat foil blade. It's more squarish than like a diamond cross section that we use, which is kind of cool. And that reminded me that I did come across uh, one resource that talked about fencing in a French fencing style in like the mid 17th century. So a little outside SCA time period, but well within my spaceman version of time period things here. But they talked about like in this style, like the face was off target, right? Like there was no masks, so you don't hit each other in the face. And if you did by accident, you had to go apologize profusely. So it's almost like Donovan and I are fighting each other. I hit him way too hard, which is breaking our social rules here in the SCA. I should go apologize for jacking him. So it's kind of cool to see some of the social parallels between that. And they didn't throw cuts. It was very thrust centric, which I thought was kind of interesting. So yeah, that's but the closest I found is that just don't hit this target because I don't have any gear on there, which we see a lot in HEMA. Like, so I do a bunch of saber fencing in HEMA, and if you don't have leg pads on, you tell your opponent, "I don't have leg pads on. Please don't hit me in the legs," and you just work around that. So again, more things change, more they kind of stay the same in that regard. Um, Another question came in. This one's also for Mega. Mega, can Her Highness speak more about using epic poetry to study martial culture from those peoples who did not have feck books, basically fight books?
Man, spend an hour and a half on this alone. Okay. So there are let me give you an example. Hold on. Control. Yeah. Okay. So there is a poet, and he is pre-Islamic. He's Antar ibn Shaddad. And he was, by the way, poet, sword person is a trope. I don't know if you've noticed that, but there's an awful lot of sword poets out there. Um, he has a bunch of poetry that he wrote, and this is pre-Islamic poetry. So he dealt with the divine and worshiping the gods that were sort of semi-local at that particular time. Rumi referenced him, by the way. And he would talk about his fights, and he would have boast poetry where he would basically, pardon me, I'm not supposed to use that word, Shiza talk his opponents in poetic form, which he would compose on the spot, to I think to encourage them to sort of attack him wildly. Uh, so, but he talks a lot about how his weapons were made. This sword that I wield, my good Indian sword. So he's in old Persia, but he's talking about the good sword that he has that comes from India. Aha. So that is a research rabbit hole for me. That's where I begin to think about, okay, the poetry from the time period, what it said about how they fought, or the weapons that they had, or where they sourced them from, which talks about trade routes. And so, like, there's a lot there. I do a lot of research around Sangam era poetry. There's a text called the Icononanaru, which is about those poems are about the external world, so like kings, wars, people are named by name, and there's a lot of stuff in there about elephants, and how they resolved their conflicts through blood, and also in Demons Walk the Earth, and it was great, and like how they conceived of war as demons ravaging across the land. So there's a lot of stuff that's in there, and man, it's a good idea, Orlando. We should do, yeah, it was a diss track. We should do a class together. That would be fun. Yes, like Sarah Noah earlier. Okay,
Awesome.
I'll shut up now.
Great. So what I hear is that we need Mega to do an entire hour and a half presentation just on this. That's what I've learned. in the last few seconds
I
because
need
you're
my
not going to be busy
resources closer
enough.
to hand. I need them closer to hand.
Yeah, because you're not going to be busy enough for the next year. All right. Another question that we got in here. The question is, I've been following conversation on SCA Rapier about women and gender minorities and challenges they face in SCA fencing. Are there any special challenges with martial ANS for those groups? Who would like to start with that one?
That was, as I just said, this long enough silence, I'll jump in. Um, I I actually haven't experienced significant barriers in that way within this space. I think particularly because I do a lot of written work and writing on a page, I think it's easier for people, for better or for worse, than to forget or not think about gender when they're reading someone's points. So I'm grateful I haven't experienced much of it, but I don't feel I have experienced much of it.
Yeah, I'm gonna second what Bela is saying in that I don't feel like I've run into any particular challenges around that. And I feel like, particularly locally, we have a really good community around this kind of thing that is very supportive of martial ANS pursuits.
I hesitate to speak up in response to this question. Um, but a thing that I have heard a number of times, uh, it's less of a barrier of entry and more just another hurdle to deal with if you're recreating plays. Um, is that to summarize, barring a couple of notable exceptions, um, for them presenting humans, most of the plates don't look like you, which, depending on the individual, may or may not prove to be a problem. But it's a thing that has been brought up to me. Take it for what it will. It certainly hasn't seemed to slow anyone down that I deal with or who has kicked my butt with period techniques on the regular. Um, but it's a thing that was mentioned to me a few times. So yeah, except for Walpurgis, exactly, Bella. Like barring our Saint Walpurgis, um, is the notable exception, and I think there are one or two others, but she definitely is the one who comes to mind.
I think that while that is one of the challenges in studying from historical texts, I think that it is something that is more widely applicable because there's such a wide range of body types across all genders that a relatively small percentage of people are gonna look exactly like the plates from the book. Um, Whichever book you might be, working out of.
Awesome, fantastic. Appreciate all the answers on that one as well. So we're at 9:30, so we're at the end of our presentation. Thanks for everyone who sent in great questions either ahead of time or during chat today. The chat was pretty lively with chatter back and forth, which is I always like seeing, which is really cool. I just want to thank all four of our panelists for making time in their busy weeks and busy summers here to sword nerd with me here. This has been a presentation a little bit, a couple of months in the making here, and I appreciate everyone taking the free time to help me out with this one. Um, for people, this will be recorded for people that want to rewatch this later. I've tried collecting all the links that I could from the chat, so we'll put that in like the video description so you can get the links later, especially for people that are watching this in the future. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming out to all four panelists. Thanks everyone who come out from home to watch. Super appreciate it.